I was just fixing the fence. That's all standing in the July heat, hammering a loose picket with my father's old claw hammer. The sun cut sideways through the slats, the air smelled like fresh-cut grass and hot concrete. Then I heard water on the other side. I leaned over the top of the fence just to look, and she was right there. My new neighbor, hose in hand, water spraying everywhere. She didn't flinch. She gave me a quiet half-smile and said, "You look like you know how to fix things. Come help me instead." I didn't know it then, but that sentence had been rehearsed long before she ever moved in. My name is Garrett Ainsley. I'm 40 years old, and I'm a freelance carpenter in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I build kitchen cabinets, refinish hardwood floors, replace rotting porches, anything involving wood, a tape measure, and more patience than most people have. I learned the trade from my father, who did the same work in the same city his entire life. He passed 7 years ago and left me two things: a small craftsman-style house on a quiet street near the university and a claw hammer he'd used every working day for 30 years. The handle had been replaced twice. The steel head was original, worn smooth, slightly chipped at the claw. I hung it on a nail in the garage next to his old leather work belt, and I used it nearly every day. Not because I didn't own newer tools, because picking it up felt like shaking his hand. 2 years before any of this happened, my wife Colleen and I divorced. No children, no courthouse drama, just a slow, quiet collapse. She wanted more travel, more ambition, a bigger house in a better neighborhood. I couldn't give her that. I wasn't angry about the divorce. I just wasn't enough of what she needed, and she had the honesty to say so. She took what she wanted, signed the papers, and drove away. I kept the house. I kept the hammer. I kept my routine. Mornings I'd be in the workshop by 6:30 cutting boards, sanding joints, dry-fitting shelves for that week's client. The shop smelled like sawdust and linseed oil. Afternoons I'd fix something around the property, a gutter pulling loose, a porch step splitting, a section of fence leaning a little more each month. Evenings I'd sit on the front porch with a cold beer, listening to the cicadas wind up in that thick Louisiana hum. I wasn't lonely. I just didn't have a reason to turn around when I walked through the living room. The neighbors on my right, the Delaney's, a retired couple, had moved out a month earlier. Their house sat vacant until one Tuesday when a moving truck backed into the driveway. A woman got out of a car behind it. Alone, long dark hair, no help, carrying boxes herself, stacking them on the porch one by one. I almost walked over to help. Almost. But I went to my shop instead. 3 weeks went by before she knocked on my door. In that time, I saw her from a distance a handful of times watering the patchy lawn the Delaneys had neglected, hauling a small bookcase from the trunk of her car, sitting on the back steps in the evening with a laptop balanced on her knees and a mug of something steaming beside her. We waved once across the shared driveway. That was the extent of it. I didn't think about her much. I thought about the fence, which was leaning worse than ever. I thought about a set of maple shelves I was building for a dentist's office in Prairieville. I thought about the text from Colleen that was still sitting unanswered on my phone, blinking at me every time I picked it up to check the weather. Then one Thursday afternoon, she knocked. She was holding a box of homemade blueberry muffins, still warm. Her name was Nora Seavey, 36. Freelance editor. The conversation lasted 5 minutes, but one moment stayed. On her way out, she glanced down at my father's hammer on the porch railing. She looked at it longer than a person looks at a tool. Then she said, "That's a good hammer. Somebody loved it." I stood on the porch after she left, replaying those words. Hundreds of people had complimented my cabinets, my shelves, my finishes. Not one had ever said a word about the hammer. I stood on the porch after she left, holding that box of muffins. Somebody loved it. She didn't say used it or owned it. She said loved, as if the wear on the steel told a story she could read. I ate a muffin and went back to fixing the step. That evening I sat on the porch with a beer, watching the warm yellow light in Nora's kitchen above the fence line. My phone buzzed a text from Colleen about some property document. I read it, set the phone face down, and didn't reply. The message sat there like a stone I wasn't ready to turn over. The following week, Nora knocked again. Her outdoor faucet was leaking a cracked coupling that had turned the soil beneath it to mud. I grabbed my toolbox and went over. The faucet was genuinely broken, but I noticed she'd already tried to fix it herself. There was plumber's tape wrapped around the pipe, messy but deliberate, and her knuckles had small scratches, the kind you get from a wrench slipping in a tight space. She wasn't pretending to be helpless. She'd exhausted her own options before asking. I liked that about her immediately. I replaced the coupling in 10 minutes. She offered me iced tea mint, homemade, so cold the glass fogged instantly in the humid air, and I stayed on her back porch for nearly an hour, talking about the neighborhood and about the oak tree 3 houses down that was older than the city's sewer system. She laughed at that, a short, genuine sound, and I liked how it caught me off guard because I hadn't been trying to be funny. From that afternoon, a rhythm took hold. Every few days, Nora had some small task, a door hinge that squeaked, a bookshelf she wanted, anchored to the wall, a back door lock that swelled shut in the humidity. Each time I came over, the repair took 15 minutes, and the conversation lasted an hour. I started learning about her life. She edited manuscripts for independent literary publishers, mostly quiet fiction, the kind of novels that don't make bestseller lists, but stay with you for years after you close them. She loved old paperbacks, not rare editions worth money, just books that had been read so many times the spines were cracked and the pages smelled like vanilla and dust. She'd been living alone for a long time and offered no explanation why. I didn't press. She didn't press me either. That was part of what made our conversations feel easy. Neither of us was trying to unlock the other. We were just two people sitting on a porch, saying whatever came naturally, letting the rest stay where it was. She asked about the hammer one afternoon while I was tightening a cabinet door under her kitchen sink. I told her my father used it every working day for 3 decades. The handle had been replaced twice, but the head was still the original forged steel, the part that strikes, the part that shapes. She listened the way she always did, completely, without fidgeting, without rehearsing her response while I was still talking. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So it's still his hammer, even though almost nothing original is left." I sat back on my heels and stared at her. In 7 years of carrying that hammer, I had never once thought about it that way. It was a question about identity dressed up as a comment about tools. And she was exactly right. There were details I noticed and dismissed at the time. Details that only made sense later, when I knew the full truth. Nora always had black coffee ready when I came by, brewed strong, no sugar, no cream. But I had never told her how I took my coffee. She turned off her music before I arrived, every single time, but I'd never mentioned that I preferred quiet. One afternoon, I spotted a folded newspaper on her kitchen table. It was a local feature from the previous year, about a set of oak cabinets I'd hand-built for a church downtown. My name appeared in the 3rd paragraph. The paper was folded precisely at that paragraph, the crease worn soft from being opened and refolded more than once. I almost asked about it, but I told myself it was a local paper, a local story. Anyone might have come across it. I thought about mentioning it. I almost did, one evening when we were sitting on her porch after I'd rehung a crooked cabinet door. The newspaper was right there on the table between us, folded at my name, but she was telling me about a manuscript. She was editing a novel about a lighthouse keeper, and the way she described the story, the way she found beauty in the loneliness of it, made me forget the newspaper entirely. That's what Nora did. She made the present moment feel so full that the questions could wait, and I let them wait because I wanted the moment more than I wanted the answers. Looking back now, I know none of it was coincidence. Nothing about Nora being next door was accidental. She had found me the way I find the grain in a piece of wood, by looking carefully, patiently, until the pattern revealed itself. The days took on a texture I hadn't felt in years. Mornings in the workshop, I'd hear Nora's back door open and close through the window. I'd catch the faint scent of her coffee drifting over the fence to mingle with my sawdust. Afternoons, when I worked in the yard, I could hear the rhythm of her typing through the screen door, a soft, steady percussion that became as natural to me as the sound of my own breathing. She never interrupted. She just existed alongside my day, quietly, the way good weather does. One evening, I was mounting the heavy bookshelf in her living room, solid pine, 3 feet wide, bolted to the wall studs. I was reaching overhead with the hammer when it slipped from my sweaty grip and hit the hardwood floor. The handle cracked a clean, sharp split right down the hickory grain. I stood there, staring at it, far longer than the moment deserved. It was just a handle. I'd replaced it before. but the sound, that dry, final snap, landed deep in my chest, in a place that had nothing to do with wood. Nora didn't say, "Don't worry, it'll be fine." She didn't minimize it or redirect. She sat down on the floor beside me, picked up the broken hammer carefully, and placed it back in my hand. She said quietly, "You can fix it. That's what you do." That night I took the hammer home and fitted a new handle, the third one, on the same old head. And for the first time in 2 years, I repaired something and felt the work settle into me the way it used to, deeply, solidly, like it actually mattered. After that evening, something shifted. Nothing dramatic, nothing declared, but the air between us changed the way the sky changes before a slow, warm rain. You feel it before you see it. Nora started leaving her back door propped open in the afternoons when I worked in the yard. Sometimes she'd carry out a glass of iced tea without a word, set it on the flat top of the fence rail, and walk back inside. She never waited for a thank you. Her way of giving was quiet and complete, like rain, which falls not for a response, but simply because that's what it does. I started taking more care with the fence between our houses. I planed the rough edges smooth. I sanded the tops of the pickets until they were soft under a palm. I sealed the wood so it wouldn't crack in the summer heat. I wasn't maintaining a barrier. I was tending something that connected us, making it worth looking at, because now someone was looking. One warm afternoon, I was planing a board at the workbench and I felt someone watching. I looked up. Nora was standing on her side of the fence, arms resting on the top rail. The moment our eyes met, she turned away. But I caught the expression before she hit it. She'd been smiling. Not at me. To herself. The quiet, private smile of someone who is happy for a reason only they know. I went back to planing, but I was smiling too. My phone buzzed on the workbench. Colleen. A voicemail I didn't play, then a text. "We need to talk about the house, Garrett. Don't ignore me." I read it, turned the phone face down, and picked up the sanding block. Late afternoon light slanted through the fence slats, painting gold bars across the concrete. Through Nora's screen door, I could hear her keyboard. I kept working. It was a Saturday morning, early August. I was drinking coffee on the front porch, feet on the railing, when a white SUV pulled up at the curb. Colleen stepped out of the passenger side, new haircut, designer sunglasses, heels that clicked on the walkway like a countdown. A man in a charcoal suit got out behind her. Her attorney. She walked up my porch steps and told me she'd had the divorce settlement reviewed. There was equity in the house that hadn't been accounted for, appreciation in value, improvements I'd made since the split, market gains she was legally entitled to share. She wanted the property sold and proceeds divided. Or I could buy out her share. The attorney slid a printed summary across the porch railing. I looked at the number. My coffee went cold in my hand. I kept my face still. That was something I'd learned from my father, how to absorb a hit without showing it. But inside, something dropped through the floor. This was my parents' house, the house where I learned to hold a hammer at the age of 6, the house where I'd replaced every window with my own hands, refloored every room with hardwood I milled myself, rebuilt the porch with lumber I selected board by board. Every nail in every wall had been placed by me or by my father. And now Colleen, who had spent most of our marriage asking me to sell the place and buy something newer, wanted to convert all of that labor and memory into a wire transfer. I told her I needed time. She tilted her head and let out a short, humorless laugh. "You always need time, Garrett. That was the whole problem with us." She turned to leave, and that's when she saw Nora. Nora was standing on her side of the fence, garden hose in hand, completely still. She hadn't spoken a word. She hadn't moved. She was just there, quiet, watching, holding the hose, with the nozzle turned off. Colleen's eyes moved from Nora to me and back. A thin, sharp smile crossed her face. She said, loud enough for both of us to hear, "Oh, so that's why you didn't answer my calls." Then she turned to Nora directly. "Honey, he's sweet, but he'll never choose you over a piece of wood and a dead man's hammer." Nora didn't speak. She didn't flinch. She reached down, clicked the hose nozzle off, and walked inside. The screen door closed behind her so softly, it barely made a sound softer than my own breathing. And that near-silent close was the most painful thing I heard all morning. Louder than Colleen's words. Louder than the folder snapping shut. It was the sound of someone choosing dignity over confrontation, and I didn't know whether it was grace or heartbreak. I didn't follow her. I didn't say a word to Colleen. I sat on the porch after the white SUV pulled away, Colleen's perfume still lingering in the humid air, and I held the hammer in both hands. For the first time, I asked myself the question she'd planted. Was I holding on to this house because I loved it, or because I was afraid of what waited outside it? The days that followed were a silence I hadn't known since before Nora moved in. She didn't knock. No iced tea on the fence. No typing through the screen door. I worked on the fence alone. I hammered nails into boards that didn't need nailing. I sanded surfaces that were already smooth. I replaced a perfectly good gate latch with an identical one, just to have something to do with my hands. One afternoon I caught myself standing at the fence with my ear tilted toward her yard, listening for any sound, footsteps, a door, a keyboard, anything, and heard nothing but cicadas and my own pulse. The absence of Nora was a physical thing. Like a missing tooth your tongue can't stop finding. I repaired things that weren't broken because movement was easier than stillness, and my own hammer was easier to listen to than the quiet on her side. That quiet pressed against me like the July humidity, invisible, everywhere, suffocating. I turned it over every night. Maybe Nora pulled away because of Colleen's cruelty. Maybe hearing my ex-wife call the most important object in my life, a dead man's hammer, had cut her somewhere I couldn't reach. But there was another possibility, the one that pinned me to the ceiling at 3 in the morning. Maybe she pulled away because of what I didn't say. I hadn't defended her. I hadn't stood up from my chair. I hadn't said a single word. I just sat there holding a hammer, while someone I was beginning to care about deeply walked away, carrying her hurt, like something she'd packed long ago and hoped she wouldn't need again. Colleen was right about something real. I always chose silence. I let moments pass and told myself I'd handle it later. But later has weight, and eventually it gets too heavy to carry. I replayed Colleen's visit 100 times. Each replay I noticed something I'd missed. The way her attorney had measured the porch railing with his eyes, calculating the value of the wood. The way Colleen had glanced at the workshop behind the house, not with nostalgia, but with the appraising look of someone estimating square footage. She didn't see a home. She saw an asset, and maybe that was always the difference between us. I saw things for what they were, and she saw them for what they were worth. But then I'd circle back to her words, "You always need time," and I'd wonder if maybe I used patience as a hiding place, the way some people use anger or ambition. Maybe slowness was just another wall, built one careful board at a time, to keep the world from getting close enough to hurt. The attorney sent a formal letter, 30-day deadline. I sat at the kitchen table with a calculator, bank statements, and a stack of invoices. The math was merciless. I didn't have the cash. I called the bank, but freelance carpentry doesn't photograph well on a loan application. No salary, no benefits, no employer letterhead, just receipts and the good word of homeowners whose kitchens I'd rebuilt with my hands. The house I grew up in, the house my father had left me, the house where his hammer had hung on the same nail for 3 decades, was slipping through my fingers. I sat at that kitchen table until the numbers blurred. Then I closed the folder and put it in the drawer where I kept my father's death certificate and my divorce papers. 3 documents, 3 losses, all of them stored in the same drawer, because that's where I kept the things I didn't know how to carry. At night I'd sit on the porch and see Nora's window lit a warm gold square in the dark. She was in there, still awake, still so close, but the world on her side of the fence felt as distant as a country I'd lost the passport to. The humidity pressed down on everything. The cicadas screamed, and the fence I'd spent weeks making beautiful stood in the darkness between our yards, perfect, polished, and utterly pointless. I ran my hand along the top rail one evening and felt the smoothness I'd sanded into it. All that care, all that attention. For what? For a woman on the other side who wouldn't even look at it anymore. I pulled my hand back and went inside. The house felt enormous. Every room echoed with the absence of something I hadn't known I was building toward until it was gone. 5 days of silence. I couldn't take it anymore. I picked up the hammer, new handle, old head, and walked around the fence to Nora's front door. I knocked. It was the first time I had ever knocked on her door. In every interaction we'd had since the day she brought muffins to my porch, she had been the one to come to me. Standing on her steps with the hammer in my hand, I felt the full weight of that reversal settle on my shoulders. The weight of all the moments I should have walked toward her instead of waiting. She opened the door slowly, Her eyes were faintly red around the edges, but her voice was steady, the voice of someone who has finished with tears and is waiting to see what comes next. I said, I should have said something. On the porch, that morning, I should have said something and I didn't. She looked at the hammer in my hand. She always looked at the hammer first and said, simply, come in. Her living room was dim, curtains half drawn, late afternoon light filtering through in soft amber panels across the floor. I followed her past the bookshelf, down the hall, to the kitchen, and that's when I saw it. On the shelf I'd mounted for her, the same shelf where the hammer slipped and cracked, there was a framed photograph. It showed the interior of a church, the same church downtown where I'd built those oak cabinets the year before. But the photo wasn't of the cabinets, it was of me. I was crouched over a piece of wood, brush in hand, applying varnish with the careful, unhurried attention I give to everything I build. My head was down. My sleeves were rolled. I had no idea anyone was watching. The print was slightly yellowed, edges worn from handling, at least a year old. Nora sat at the kitchen table and told me the truth. She was an editor that was real. She'd been freelancing for nearly 10 years. But she had known about me before she moved in next door. About a year earlier, during the hardest season of her life, her mother had died after a long illness, and she'd just ended a relationship that had hollowed her out completely. She walked into that downtown church, not for a service, not searching for God or comfort. She just needed a place to sit where no one would ask her how she was doing. The building was empty except for one person, me. She watched from a back pew as I worked sanding, staining, brushing on varnish stroke by slow stroke, absorbed in the wood and the finish, unaware of anything beyond the cabinet in front of me. She said, "You were the first person I saw who wasn't performing anything. You were just there, being careful with something." Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking slightly. I could see it in the way she held her coffee mug, both palms wrapped around it like she was trying to keep something from spilling. Everyone I knew at that point was trying to be something. My ex was performing success. My mother's doctors were performing optimism. Even the grief counselor was performing empathy. And then I walked into a church and saw a man alone with a piece of wood, and he was just doing it right. Because it mattered to him, not because anyone was grading him, not because anyone was watching. She took the photograph from 30 feet away. She kept it. Months later, when the Delaney house went up for sale, she bought it. Not for the neighborhood, not for the square footage, because it was next to mine. Not coincidence. Never coincidence. I sat across from her for a long time. The light through the curtains was turning deep gold. The photograph sat on the shelf across the room, small, yellowed, still. The hammer rested across my palm. I wasn't angry. I didn't feel deceived. What I felt was something I'd never experienced during my marriage. Someone had seen me at my most unguarded, my most ordinary, at a moment when I had no audience and no act, and decided that was enough. Not my best moment, not my most impressive work, just me, on an ordinary Tuesday, doing ordinary work with ordinary tools, and somehow that ordinary moment was the truest thing she'd seen in months. I understood it, sitting there at her kitchen table, because I'd spent my whole life believing that the way you treat unimportant things reveals who you really are. Every joint I cut, every surface I sanded, every nail I set, I did it the same way whether the client was watching or not. My father taught me that. And Nora, without knowing his name or hearing his voice, had seen it in me from 30 feet away in an empty church. That was what she chose. I told her my truth. "I might lose this house," I said. The words were flat, factual, the way I'd say a board was warped. She didn't hesitate. "I didn't come for the house, Garrett. I came for the man who keeps fixing the fence even when nobody's watching." I made a decision. I'd find a way to keep the house loans, extra projects, 7-day work weeks, whatever it required. But more important than the money, more important than the deadline, I did something I had never done before. I set the hammer down on Nora's kitchen table. My father's hammer. The tool I had carried every day for 7 years. I placed the steel head gently on the oak surface and let go. It was the first time that hammer had left my hand in a place that wasn't my own home. Nora looked at it lying between us, heavy, still, real. Then she looked up at me. She didn't speak. She understood. The week after that, nothing dramatic happened. We didn't go on a date. We didn't hold hands. I went back to my house. She stayed in hers, but in the fence between our yards, there was one picket I deliberately left unmounted, a gap just wide enough to pass a glass through. Nora noticed immediately. She didn't say a word about it. She just started placing a glass of iced tea in that opening, every afternoon condensation beating down the sides, a sprig of fresh mint floating on top. I'd find it waiting when I came outside to work, cold and sweating in the heat, and I'd drink it standing at my workbench while sawdust collected on my boots. She was always on the other side. I could hear her pages turning, her keyboard tapping, her back door opening and closing. The gap in the fence said everything neither of us was ready to say out loud. During that first month, I threw myself into work harder than I had in years. I took on 3 major projects: custom walnut cabinets for a Cajun restaurant on Government Street, a full hardwood floor restoration at the parish library downtown, and floor-to-ceiling built-in shelving for an independent bookshop on Perkins Road. The income mattered. The bank would want to see it. But beyond the money, the work gave me something to pour my hands into while I waited for the rest of my life to take shape. Nora offered to help with the loan application. She was an editor. She knew how to make language do exactly what you needed it to do. Over the course of a week, she restructured my entire application. She turned my scattered pile of handwritten invoices, client references, and tax returns into a narrative that made my career look like what it actually was: steady, dependable, built on 2 decades of honest work. She wrote cover language that was clear and persuasive without being flashy. She was doing for my words what I did for wood, stripping away the rough parts, finding the grain underneath, making it presentable without making it false. Late at night, I'd look out my kitchen window and see her light still burning. She was working on my paperwork at midnight, rewriting a paragraph, double-checking a figure, making sure a comma was in the right place. One night, close to 1 in the morning, I walked to the fence and tapped lightly on a picket with my knuckle. A few seconds later, her face appeared in the gap, half lit by the porch light, half smiling in that quiet way she had. "Go to sleep, Garrett," she said. "I'll fix your commas." I stood there in the dark for a moment after she disappeared back inside, and I realized I was smiling too. The second month, the bank approved the loan. I signed the papers on a Wednesday morning in a small office downtown that smelled like toner and carpet cleaner. I could keep the house. Colleen's attorney sent the final settlement document by courier. She signed it cold, efficient, finished. She climbed into the white SUV and it pulled away from the curb without slowing down. She didn't look back. Neither did I. That evening, I sat on the front porch with a beer, the way I always did. The cicadas were loud. The air was thick with the smell of warm pine and cut grass. The empty chair beside me had been empty for 2 years. And then, without a word, Nora came walking around the end of the fence. Nobody had invited her. She didn't ask if it was a good time. She carried her glass of iced tea up the porch steps, sat down in that empty chair like she'd been sitting there every evening for months, and we watched the sky go from orange to purple to black without saying a single word. 15 minutes of perfect silence. It was the most complete I'd felt in longer than I could remember. 3 months after that, we started cooking together. She'd prepare something in her kitchen, pasta with fresh basil and tomatoes from the small herb garden she'd planted along the fence, and I'd grill on my side, burgers or sausage or whatever I had, and the smoke drifting across the yard and mixing with the smell of whatever she was simmering indoors. We'd eat together on my porch as the sun went down. The fence still stood between our yards. The gap was still there. Neither of us ever suggested taking it down. It had become part of the architecture of whatever we were building, not a wall, but a threshold we chose to cross. 6 months after that evening at her kitchen table, on a rare cold night in Baton Rouge, the kind of January evening when the air has an unfamiliar bite and the whole city smells like damp pine needles and chimney smoke, I was at Nora's house fixing a bedroom window that wouldn't open. The wood had swollen through 100 seasons of humidity, and the sash was frozen in its track. I planed the channel, waxed the runners, tested the slide 3 times until it moved as smoothly as a drawer in a cabinet I'd built myself. When I finally stood up, stretched my back, and turned around, Nora was standing directly behind me, closer than she had ever been, close enough that I could smell her shampoo, something clean and simple, like cotton and rain. She reached out and took my hand. Her fingers were cold. Mine were still warm from gripping the hammer. She looked at me steadily and said, "You don't have to fix everything to stay." I kissed her. For the first time. It was slow and unhurried and gentle, like fitting the last board into a joint I'd measured 3 times. No rush, no fumbling, just the quiet, certain pressure of something settling into the place it was always meant to be. 1 year later, Nora still lived in her house. I still lived in mine. But both our back doors stayed open from morning until night, and most evenings one of us was in the other's kitchen. My father's hammer, 3 handles, one original steel head, now rested on Nora's bookshelf, right beside the photograph she had taken of me in the church. I never took the hammer back. It belonged there. Both objects did the image of who I was when no one was watching, and the tool that taught me what it means to be careful with something that matters. The fence between our houses still stood. The gap was still there. Every afternoon, a glass of iced tea still appeared in that narrow opening, cold and sweating in the heat, mint leaves floating on top. We didn't need to tear the fence down to be together. We just needed to know it was there and to choose, every single day, to step through it. I spent 2 years fixing everything in that house: the fence, the plumbing, the hinges, the steps, the windows, the porch, the gutters, the baseboards. I fixed things because repairing objects was easier than repairing myself. Colleen was right about one thing. I always needed time. I always moved slowly. I always let the moment pass and promised myself I'd deal with it later. But she was wrong about the thing that mattered most. I didn't hold on to that hammer because I was afraid to let it go. I held on because I hadn't yet found anyone worth setting it down for. Nora didn't come to fix me. She didn't show up with a plan or an ultimatum or a list of things I needed to change. She came because she saw me at a moment when I had no idea anyone was looking, and she decided that what she saw was enough. Sometimes the person who changes your life doesn't knock on your front door. They stand on the other side of the fence, holding a garden hose, water spraying everywhere, and say, "Come help me instead." And all you have to do is set the hammer down and step through. Have you ever met someone who showed up at exactly the right moment, no noise, no grand announcement, who just quietly appeared and changed everything? If someone chose you for who you really are, not the version you perform for the world, but the one that exists when you think nobody's watching, would you trust it? If this story reached you, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Drop a comment and tell me, who did you set the hammer down for? I read every single one of them. I promise.